Welcome back for another deep dive with us. This time we're taking a look at this English learning podcast, all about love and apologies and even pet names.
Interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be kind of basic,
Yeah.
like just some phrases for English learners,
Yeah.
but it actually had a surprising amount of depth. I mean, even as a native English speaker, I found myself thinking about these phrases
Yeah.
and how we use language in relationships in a whole new way.
It is fascinating, isn't it? How we use these phrases all the time, but we rarely stop to think about what they really mean or like the cultural assumptions baked into them.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's jump right in.
Okay.
One of the first things that the podcast tackles is the difference between to love and to be in love.
Okay.
And they made a point that to be in love is very specifically about romantic love, right? It's those intense, heart-fluttery feelings.
Right.
Like you wouldn't say you're in love with pizza,
Right. Exactly.
although some people might.
Well, maybe. But you see, that distinction actually reflects a cultural understanding of love as a spectrum. Oh, okay.
So like to love can be applied to all sorts of different relationships and emotions, right?
Right.
From family to friends to even, I don't know, your favorite hobby.
Yeah.
But to be in love implies a much deeper level of emotional connection, that all-consuming feeling that we usually associate with romantic partners.
And I think it just makes you think about how different cultures might view or express these concepts. Like, have you ever thought about that difference between loving something and being in love with it?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it really gets to the heart of how language shapes our experiences of the world around us.
Hmm.
For example, some cultures may have very specific terms for different types of love,
Right.
while others might use the same word much more broadly. And this can have a huge impact on how people perceive and navigate relationships.
Absolutely. Okay, now get ready for this one. The podcast then goes into the phrase, can we talk?
Oh.
And honestly, I think just hearing those words can send shivers down anyone's spine.
We've all been on the receiving end of that phrase, and it's very rarely a good thing.
Yeah, it's not usually followed by like, I got you a present.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, what is it about those three little words that makes them so powerful?
Oh, I think there's definitely a psychological element at play. Like, it's the signal that shifts the tone from just like a casual conversation to something much more serious.
Mhm.
And it comes with all of this anticipation and dread. Like, you're about to be put on the defense.
Yes. Like bracing yourself for the unknown. And the podcast had this funny bit about how you would never use that phrase for like lighthearted topics. Like you imagine saying, "Can we talk? I just baked cookies."
I mean, unless maybe those cookies represent some deeper issue in the relationship, like maybe they burnt them or forgot an ingredient and now it's a symbol for something.
Okay, that is hilarious. I'm
Yeah.
totally stealing that example.
Yeah.
But it really shows you how loaded that phrase is with a certain kind of emotional weight.
Hmm.
They also played audio clips of the phrase, "You know what I mean,"
Ugh.
which I thought was brilliant because it showed how just a tone of voice can completely change the meaning.
Oh, for sure.
Sometimes it's a statement, sometimes it's a question. You can even make it sound aggressive if you say it in just the right way.
Oh, absolutely. It's like this secret code within the language where these subtle shifts in intonation convey a whole range of meanings.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one reason why communicating through text or email can be so tricky. You lose all those nonverbal cues that give context to the words.
It really makes you wonder how many arguments are started because we can't hear the tone of voice.
Right.
Like imagine if we all just talked face to face more. How many misunderstandings could be avoided?
I think that's a fascinating point, and it ties into the bigger idea of how much communication relies on those nonverbal cues. Facial expressions, body language, even the way we pause or hesitate.
Right.
All of those things contribute to the overall message we're trying to get across.
So it's not just what we say, but how we say it. It's like a whole performance, even in just everyday conversations.
Yeah, it's true.
All right. Let's move on to something a bit more structured. The podcast highlighted a few relationship phrases that I think we can all relate to, especially if you've ever had those defining the relationship talks.
Oh, those talks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They picked out 3 phrases that really resonated with me. And the first one was, where is this relationship going?
Mm-hmm.
Which, let's be honest, is a question that can cause some serious anxiety.
Yeah, it's a classic line, isn't it? And so direct. Like, it demands clarity and it forces both people to confront their expectations for the future of the relationship. And I think that's probably why it can feel so loaded, especially in the early stages.
Totally. It's like you're suddenly being graded on your level of commitment. The second phrase they talked about was, maybe it's time we
Oh.
which they left open-ended, but you can almost hear the dramatic music playing.
It's like you're standing at a crossroads. That phrase often comes before a big decision or a turning point in a relationship.
Like moving in together or getting engaged or even breaking up.
Exactly.
And the way it's phrased, maybe it's time we,
Hmm.
implies that it's a joint decision, like a shared responsibility for what happens next.
Yeah.
And lastly, they talked about the phrase, we've had our laughs, which to me always has this tinge of sadness to it.
It does, doesn't it? It's like you're acknowledging the good times while also saying that things have changed, that maybe the relationship has run its course.
It's bittersweet, like a farewell to a chapter that's coming to a close.
Yeah, I think so.
But it's interesting. The podcast made the point that these phrases aren't only for romantic relationships.
Oh, right.
Where is this going?
Mm.
It could be about your job or a creative project,
Yeah.
or even just trying to figure out what's happening in a confusing movie.
That's true. It shows how adaptable language is. Like, we take these common phrases and apply them to all these different areas of our lives. Maybe it's time we. Could be about anything from changing jobs to ending a friendship to rearranging the furniture.
Wow, I never thought about it that way.
Yeah.
But you're totally right. It's like these phrases become these tools for navigating change and making decisions in all aspects of our lives.
It's pretty fascinating when you think about it that way. These seemingly simple phrases actually encompass all these universal human experiences, from love to work to friendship, even just trying to figure out a weird movie.
Okay, so now let's talk about something I think we can all relate to. Pet names.
Oh, yeah.
The podcast had me laughing out loud at some of the examples they used, like Honey Bunny and Sweetie Pie.
Oh, yeah.
They could be so cheesy, but also so endearing at the same time.
Right. I think they can definitely be a little cringeworthy sometimes. But it's so interesting how pet names are this global phenomenon. You find them in almost every culture and language.
I know, it's true.
And they often reflect these very unique cultural norms and expressions of affection.
Yeah. Like they mentioned gordita in Spanish,
Oh,
which literally means little fatty,
I know.
but it's used as a term of endearment. And in French, they talk about ma puce, which means my flea.
Hmm.
It's funny to think about what these phrases literally mean, but then within a specific cultural context, they become these terms of endearment.
Yeah, it's wild how language can take something that seems insulting on the surface and turn it into a loving nickname.
It really is.
And I think it just goes to show the power of shared understanding and how we create these unique ways to express intimacy.
It makes you realize that language is constantly evolving, shaped by all these cultural nuances and the ever-changing dynamics of human connection. It's not just words on a page, It's this living, breathing thing that reflects who we are and how we relate to one another.
Right.
This reminds me of a time.
Yeah, it really speaks to the power of language to create these close bonds with the people we care about.
Yeah, it's like creating your own secret language almost, like a code that only you two understand.
Exactly. And it's not just the words themselves, right? It's the way they're said, the tone of voice, the little gestures, all of the shared history and inside jokes that give those names meaning.
It's like those inside jokes become this shorthand for all the memories and experiences that you've shared together. Speaking of sharing, I'd love to hear from you, our listeners. What are some of the pet names that you've encountered? Maybe ones that you use in your own relationships or even ones that you've heard in other cultures.
Ooh. I'm always so fascinated by the different pet names that people use. It's like a testament to how much we crave connection and how language plays such a key role in expressing those bonds.
We'll have to compare notes later on.
Yeah.
But for now, let's shift gears a little bit. So we've talked a lot about the nuances of individual words and phrases, but the podcast also brought up this idea of context in communication.
Yeah.
They used the example of apologies, how just saying I'm sorry doesn't always have the same impact.
Right, and that's a really important point. Like, a truly genuine apology needs more than just the words. It's about understanding the impact of your actions, expressing remorse and actually taking steps to make things right.
Yeah, I think we've all been there. We've all gotten those apologies that feel really hollow. Like they're just trying to avoid conflict instead of actually trying to fix the situation.
Totally. Like when someone says, I'm sorry you feel that way, instead of actually taking responsibility for what they did.
Yeah, it's like shifting the blame onto the other person's feelings. Like, I'm sorry you're upset, but it's not my fault.
Exactly. And that type of apology can actually make things worse because it completely invalidates the other person's experience. Like, you're telling them that you're not really listening to them or trying to see things from their perspective.
It's like the opposite of empathy.
Yeah, right. And that takes us back to the idea that language is really all about connection.
Uh,
And whether we're talking about love or apologies or even just everyday small talk, the words we choose and the way we use them, they can either bring us closer together or create these walls between us.
and I think that's a huge responsibility that we all share.
Absolutely.
It's so easy to just get swept up in conversations without thinking about the impact of what we're saying.
Right.
But I think if we want to have healthy relationships, we need to be really intentional about how we communicate with each other.
I agree. And this deep dive has been a really good reminder of that. We've talked about how language shapes our experiences of love, how it helps us navigate really difficult emotions, and even how simple phrases can have so much meaning packed into them.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting conversation, but I
Yeah.
think we've just scratched the surface here.
I know there's always so much more to explore when it comes to language.
So much more. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Mhm.
We've talked about how language can be used to manipulate or deflect or avoid taking responsibility. But what about the other side of that? How can we use language to be more honest, more vulnerable, and more authentic in our relationships?
That's such a good question. And one that I think we should all be thinking about. Like, what kind of language do you use to create those feelings of trust and closeness?
Mm,
How do you express your true feelings and needs to the people you care about?
right.
And how do you make sure that you're really listening and understanding when someone else is trying to do the same?
It's like we're all constantly learning and evolving our own personal language of love. And I think the more we understand the power of our words and the impact they have, the better we can be at building those really meaningful connections with the people around us.
Well said. I think that's a really good note to end on.
It feels like we've really gone deep, haven't we? From the subtle differences between to love and to be in love, to those sometimes cringy but also adorable pet names.
Mhm.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. And I think one of the biggest things I've been thinking about is how much we reveal about ourselves just through our language choices,
Yeah.
even when we're not even aware of it.
I know it's true. And it's amazing to me the power of language.
Hmm.
You know, we talked about how it can be used to express love, to apologize, to really build intimacy. But then on the flip side, it can also be used to manipulate, to deceive, even to hurt.
You're so right. I mean, think about it. We've all had those experiences where words have really hurt us, where a careless phrase can stick with you for years.
Yeah.
It's a powerful reminder that we need to be careful with our words, especially with the people we're closest to.
And I keep thinking about some of those phrases that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Like, can we talk? Or maybe it's time I mean, on the surface, they seem pretty harmless and straightforward. But there's this underlying potential there for anxiety or conflict.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to be mindful of the impact our words have on others. It's not just about the dictionary definition of what we say, but also the emotional weight that those words carry, all of those unspoken messages that we're sending.
It's like every conversation is this delicate dance where you're trying not to step on each other's toes.
I love that analogy. I think it perfectly captures how complex and nuanced communication really is. You know, we're all just trying to find that balance between expressing ourselves authentically while also being sensitive to the other person's feelings.
And sometimes we mess up, right? We say the wrong thing or our words get misinterpreted.
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, we're all human, and communication is a skill that we're always learning. But I think the key is to be open to learning from our mistakes,
Yeah.
to apologize when we need to, and just to strive for clearer, more compassionate communication.
What a great message. And I think this whole deep dive has really opened my eyes to just how much power our words have, the way they shape our relationships and how we see the world and even how we see ourselves.
It's been so great exploring all of these ideas with you, and I hope everyone listening has come away with a deeper understanding of how amazing language is, and also a sense of how we can all use it to build those really meaningful connections in our lives.
So well said. As we wrap up this episode, just remember to pay attention to the language you use, not just the words, but the tone, the intention behind them, even those little unspoken messages. Because in the end, language is all about connection. It's about bridging those gaps between us and creating understanding. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.